Before I was an Avenger, I made mistakes. And a lot of enemies.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Film Seizure at the Movies. I am Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the weekly Film Seizure podcast. Before I get started here, I just want to make sure that everyone is aware that this is going to be a non-spoiler review of Black Widow. So don't worry about me giving away any top secret info on the movie. But with that said, let's get started. Marvel is finally back. And that's been part of the promotional angle for Black Widow, which was supposed to originally come out last May, but then got moved at least twice before finally getting this year's release. And it's a big deal that Marvel has returned, because since the release of Iron Man way back in 2008, no film franchise or studio has seemed to be as successful at simply being consistently entertaining as Marvel. Maybe the Disney and Pixar animated features, but that's a slightly different story and a slightly different audience for those. But no, what Marvel has done has somehow taken this kind of dense and almost religiously appreciated original text, and then kind of managed to not only remain true to what the fans of the comic books would expect, but also make it really accessible to fans who have no starting reference. And that's an incredibly hard balance to try to strike. I mean, within fandom, it's not easy to bring in any new fans and have them appreciate the character, franchise, or whatever that you have such an appreciation for without it sometimes having to change or update that story, character, etc. I mean, just look at how Star Wars is almost kind of sliced up into three warring factions of the older fans of the original trilogy, the next generation of fans who like the prequel trilogy, and all the hubbub over the sequel trilogy that's happened. But there are several franchises out there like Star Wars and Marvel that are able to rake in serious box office cash. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, one of my Film Seizure co-hosts, Jason Oliver, he and I watched and reviewed the 9th Fast and the Furious movie. And that's a series that continues to make huge loads of cash. F9 has already made huge money. And whenever the 10th movie comes out, it will likely do it again. But any Star Wars movie that comes out, it will already have a built-in fan base. The same is often true for a lot of these serial franchises. It used to always be said that, you know, like the Star Trek movies were always made for a built-in audience because they, Paramount would know exactly how much money they could expect a Star Trek movie to make because, well, there was a built-in audience, and a lot of those people will probably go and see the movie probably more than once. So, but Marvel, well, they seem to have kind of cracked a whole different code that their distinguished competition really kind of hasn't. Not only have they figured out a formula that, you know, love it or hate it, or frustrated by it, or you've grown out of it, or whatever, it does reach a fairly wide audience. They have that formula woven into all of these disparate movies in their stable. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is almost like a macro genre unto itself. Then under that, you have all of these different movies with different types of genres. You have the general straight action movies like Iron Man or the Avengers. You have fantasy with Thor and Doctor Strange. You have space operas like the Guardians of the Galaxy and Captain Marvel. And you have a slightly smaller scale set of movies like the Spider-Man films or the Ant-Man films. And I'll come back to the small scale stuff here in just a moment. But then you look at the trilogy of movies that I have a very deep appreciation for, and that's the Captain America movies. This exemplifies for me what Marvel has been able to do with their movies, because each of those three movies are completely different in style when it comes to the action movies that they are. Captain America, the First Avenger is a war movie, but also deals with Steve Rogers as what and who he is and what he stands for, what he means to others, and so forth. Then its sequel, Captain America the Winter Soldier, is a kind of political and espionage thriller with Cap now having to stand up for what he believes in the face of what he symbolizes being kind of tainted and corrupted. Plus, he has a personal element that, again, I'll be kind of getting back around to here in just a moment. But finally, Captain America Civil War is a larger action movie and kind of deals with his relationship and his impact on his team, the Avengers. The point that I'm trying to make is that Marvel is a superhero factory, but the movies they make aren't simply superhero movies. They fall into other genres. And on top of that, they know how to best weave their characters into those different genres that fit those characters. They know when Captain America needs to be haunted by his past while also dealing with the fallout of the institution he stands for, possibly having a corrupted core that needs to be cut out of it in order to be the thing that he believes in again. They know that Spider-Man could remain close to his neighborhood and that he's a younger character and might make mistakes and needs to learn how to be as great of a hero as he can be. And Ant-Man doesn't have to be this huge scale tentpole film that guides whatever current phase the Marvel franchise is in. It can be a tad more personal and a story around characters and less about those characters need to do whatever they need to do to win that movie. So, in this huge preface I just went through, I wanted to explain why Marvel Studios has been expert in how they deal with their characters, their stories, and their various genres that they utilize to tell their stories with their characters. Black Widow is a little bit more along the lines of Captain America the Winter Soldier, with a touch of the Spider-Man and Ant-Man's, kind of small-scale personal stuff. In fact, I would say that Black Widow is probably best looked at as kind of a spiritual sequel to both The Winter Soldier and Avengers Age of Ultron, because in those two movies, we are told things about Scarlett Johansson's Natasha Romanoff that becomes fairly important to who she is, the troubles she's had to overcome, and how she is not exactly the hero she seems to be on the surface. So Black Widow really kind of delves into that by starting in 1995 when she was a teenager with a peculiar family in the United States before she is sent through the Russian Red Room program to become a widow, as they call them, an assassin that is used by the Russian intelligence bureaus as well as apparently for sale to other governments to kill political adversaries or what have you. This opening scene is where we are introduced to our four core and key characters of this movie. Natasha Romanoff, of course, that's Scarlett Johansson. Yelena Belova, who is played as an adult by Florence Pugh of Midsommar, and what was she nominated for? It was Little Women that she was nominated for an Oscar for. Then you have David Harbour's Alexei. And then you have Rachel Weisz as Melina. Now, as the credits begin from that, there are some kind of tough imagery to kind of bring home the point that the Red Room inflicted some very strange and terrible psychological and physical abuse to bring the widows to heal. Now, it's not it's not explicitly shown, but it is heavily implied that these girls kind of go through this process to become widows, and how they're kind of treated is very, very strange, and it's not exactly, I mean, it is very tough imagery, but at the same time, it really drives home that point of what they are. And then after those credits, we get into our primary story, which does take place pretty much immediately after the events of Captain America Civil War, as Natasha is on the run from Thunderbolt Ross, who is played again by William Hurt. After she, there's a scene at the German airport where the two factions of Avengers are fighting each other, and Captain America and the Winter Soldier are escaping. And Black Widow helps them escape by basically stunning Black Panther. So he does make reference that she assaulted the king of Wakanda in this. So she is on the run from Thunderbolt Ross, as she is now kind of in violation of the Sokovia Treaty that is meant to register superheroes for action, so they don't cause any more problems like that had basically happened in Age of Ultron and Civil War. So it does kind of not only picks up from there, but it also kind of ties into some of the stuff that is mentioned and talked about in some of those past Captain America movies that she was a part of. At this point, she pretty much plans to live in utter seclusion in Norway. But she is brought back into the Widow and Red Room stuff when she receives an interesting package from Yelena. And that's as far as I'll go into talking about the actual specific plot, because while there aren't huge revelations in this movie that are necessarily spoilers, things happen in the plot that has a twisty-turny element that is fun to have unfold without you really knowing what's going on. But again, it does pick up directly from Civil War, mentions things from Captain America Winter Soldier in regards to Hydra and stuff going on secretly behind the scenes at S.H.I.E.L.D. throughout the years as Hydra was basically taking over S.H.I.E.L.D. And yes, they do mention those things. As I said, this is really spiritually in line much more with Winter Soldier and the quiet and heartbreaking scene between Johansson and Mark Ruffalo in Age of Ultron, where she kind of explains some of the torment that she went through becoming the Black Widow. It keeps that tone, but picks up from that and uses it as the backbone of what this foursome of characters that we meet have to kind of deal with in being tools of a pretty shady and villainous organization. And it also manages to balance the big time action that is expected in Marvel movies, while keeping this relatively low key, like the Spider-Man and Ant-Man movies. This is the beginning of what's called Phase 4 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but we'll see exactly how some of what we see here kind of plays out in the rest of the movies coming out in this phase. If it doesn't directly connect the same way as the other movies in past phases do, I'm really kind of fine with that. This is a good enough movie and story to really kind of stand on its own. But this does kind of bring up the question, is this movie a little too late? And the unavoidable answer to this is that kind of, yes, it is. Being set in the past, but not in the way that like Captain Marvel was, makes this a peculiar entry. However, when would you release this movie otherwise? Do you release it after Iron Man 2 when she was introduced? No, because, she still needs to flesh out some of the things with her character, and a whole movie of her own to do it might not be quite as satisfying or might tell a completely different story. Obviously, it would make sense for this to come out after Civil War since it picks up right from there, but I'm not sure that that's a perfect place for this exact story. So I offer that while, yes, it seems like it's a little too late for this movie to come out, considering it takes place in the past, in the kind of pantheon of Marvel movies, having it come after Endgame, where we see the sacrifice that she makes, well, it kind of does two things. First, it makes her a person who is willing to sacrifice herself in order to balance the ledger of hers that she has always struggled with. The amount of blood on her hands is quite high, so her sacrifice is a character moment that is now looked back on in retrospect with a different lens. It also just reveals that this hero that found a family with the Avengers is ultimately a tragic character. So those are the kind of the two things why I would say it's like, yeah, I can understand why people might say this comes out at an awkward time. It comes out a little bit too late, but at the same time, I kind of disagree with that to a certain extent. I agree on one level and I disagree on another. I think that this kind of helps complete her story, and there are going to be people, I can already see it, that will kind of poo-poo this movie because it's closing out her arc, but it doesn't do it on this grand scale. The grand scale was in Endgame. Now we get a little bit more, and maybe that helps kind of fill in some gaps on how we should feel about her conclusion in Endgame a little bit differently. But let's talk about the things in this movie that I really like. First, Scarlett Johansson and Florence Pugh's scenes are just wonderful. They really kind of have the sisterly bond that is tainted in the movie, but then becomes almost like a friendly rivalry as they, become quite skilled widows, but from different so-called generations of that project. Pugh basically steals every scene that she's in, and she's kind of the outsider coming into this franchise. And on top of that, she has a little bit of a chip on her shoulder and isn't really kind of directly impressed with the whole superhero thing. It helps create a lot of sarcastic humor that you kind of chuckle at, because what she's saying is kind of from the outsider perspective that has this metaphysical quality to it. It kind of takes the piss out of Black Widow's many achievements as an Avenger and the superhero that people kind of look up to. And it's fun. It's while it is kind of taking the piss out of that, it's kind of done in a, like I said, a very sisterly sort of way. And it's a very pleasant interaction between those two. And every scene that they are in together, you're just kind of hyper focused on them. And I think that's really, really good. On the other side of this, you also have David Harbour, who plays this loud, obnoxious idiot character that is essentially Russia's equivalent to Captain America, named Red Guardian. He comes from the comics, and he does have lines that kind of seem to fly under the radar, that also maybe indicates that there are some things going on in the years that we really haven't seen in between Captain America and when the first Captain America movie, and I guess ultimately Captain Marvel, as that's the next stop on the timeline. But he's pretty funny as this kind of overweight former hero that has been basically tossed aside. And his scenes with Rachel Weisz are great because she's kind of this cog in this Russian machinery that is both fascinated with what she's accomplished, but also kind of haunted by it. But she kind of slips back into her deep cover relationship with Harbour and the two widows, and it becomes kind of endearing, and it creates this fun interaction of these four very different characters that still, in its own way, resembles a family. Now, I will say that there are a couple of surprises that I didn't quite expect. I already mentioned how they brought up Hydra and Winter Soldier from that second Captain America movie, and how it kind of plays into the story of what the process is to create a widow. I didn't quite expect that. It basically offers this very comic book concept into an otherwise kind of different type of grounded story that, like I said, is kind of grounded in its structure. Our primary villain is played by Ray Winstone, who I'm always up for seeing ever since I saw him in Sexy Beast over 20 years ago. He is very much playing kind of a James Bond type of villain, and his primary henchman, the Taskmaster, has some kind of surprises in that whole element of the story too. So there are some things I didn't quite expect to see in this movie. And when I say that Ray Winstone kind of plays a James Bond type of villain, it's kind of interesting because once Natasha settles in Norway, she's watching Moonraker and she's kind of reciting the lines along with the movie, which is fantastic because Moonraker is a movie that I stand up for in every instance that I possibly can, because I think that is a very underrated movie, partially because of the villain in that. And I think that that's something that, while this movie may not be as bombastic as some of the later Marvel movies that we'll see this year and going into next year, but I think it's something that in retrospect will grow that audience. And I think Ray Winstone is going to be kind of looked at as this kind of character who is almost obsessed in a sort of way that Hugo Drax in Moonraker was. It's just that he's playing it a lot less low key that Michael Lonsdale did in Moonraker. But I see a lot of similarities there. And I see it as also, here's the spy who's gone into space, who has done space shit. Well, so has Black Widow at this point. And I don't think she would be expected to be that type of spy or that type of espionage character. So that's kind of fun to kind of draw those connections as well. Now, this movie is directed by Kate Shortland, who hasn't made too many movies, and a lot of what she's done has been on the smaller scale, and I haven't seen any of them. I suspect that maybe my Film Seizure co-host, Jason Oliver, would probably know some of her stuff maybe a little bit more, or may have heard of some of her stuff a little bit more than I have. But this is something that's kind of to be expected these days, as many directors who get hired for these major studio releases are early in their career or they are lesser known. And part of this is obviously to bring in someone that the studio can expect to follow whatever necessary edicts are handed down to them. But Shortland does seem to have a solid handle on those quieter moments in the movie in between the action scenes. And those are some of the better scenes in the film itself. Now, if I were to give one nitpick about this movie that I totally admit is something that could be a product of something that I just personally don't like in action movies, or the 3D in which I saw this movie, or just the general style of how action is shot these days, I didn't like the hand-to-hand combat scenes, especially early on in the movie. I have a real hard time with up-close fighting scenes. I can't tell really what's going on, or who's getting punched, or who's kicking whom. It's something that takes me out of the tension of the scene, because my brain kind of edits out these types of up-close fighting shots. So it's like watching a movie that has a whole bunch of missing frames. And that's something that really kind of is unfortunate with some of these movies. I think the first Spider-Man, I had a real problem with that in the climax, because as he was fighting the main villain, it was nighttime. It was all up close. I couldn't really tell what was going on. I had to just kind of wait it out to find out, oh, okay, well, that guy is now in the ground and Spider-Man's standing over him. Okay, I get it. But overall, I really don't have much really huge to kind of to dock this movie for. Black Widow is a really solid entry in the Marvel canon. It's really not fair to compare this movie against one of the Avengers movies or Guardians of the Galaxy. It's not that type of movie. It's one of the smaller scale, more personal entries. It's also far from one of the lower tier movies. However, like with the James Bond series, I'd be happy to watch one of my least favorite Marvel or Bond films over a lot of other things that are probably better anyway. I like these movies, and I appreciate that not every movie is a large scale, massive action flick. That would get kind of boring over time. That said, I do think this movie will get a little heat unfairly for being quote unquote too small, or doesn't have the stakes that other Marvel movies have. And I think that's a really unfair thing that is often doled out to the Marvel movies that aren't the Avengers films. It doesn't help that this movie is a year late to be released, which means extra attention and pressure is applied to the movie that it wouldn't normally have. So that might affect the box office, but it's a movie that should find its audience regardless, even if it has to take a little bit of time to get there. Much like Moonraker. Anyway, it's just the fun entertainment after a whole bunch of time of not having a whole lot of fun entertainment. For those people who want this kind of action and excitement with the Marvel brand of lighthearted moments, this should satisfy. Overall, I had a lot of fun watching it, and that's what I could expect from any movie that has the Marvel branding on it. All right, so catch new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday by going to www.filmseizure.com, or by subscribing to the show at places like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, and Audible. You can also listen to us on YouTube as we upload there as well. Each Monday I do Monster Mondays, where I feature a monster movie and I find 3 things that I like about it, even if it is a really bad movie. So it's a positive, fun experience, I suppose. I guess. I don't know. Anyway, listen to that show in the exact same places that I just told you that you can find Film Seizure. Finally, I have my website, bmovieenema.com. where you can find new text review articles each and every Friday morning. I also have a YouTube channel that you can subscribe to for B-Movie Enema, where you can see clips from movies that I've used in articles, as well as see my movie hosting show there. So that should really do it for now. Again, I found Black Widow quite entertaining and satisfying. It's a solid entry in the Marvel franchise, and I suspect many others will too. But keep an eye out for more editions of Film Seizure at the Movies and Film Seizure Streams the Movies, as more will be coming out along the summer and the rest of this year. But until then, don't forget to save me the aisle seat.
We have to go back to where it all started, so they never do that to anyone again.
We're a family. We fight with you.